Back in December, American restaurant chain Shake Shack introduced a new menu. High protein, gluten-free, vegetarian, and GLP-1 friendly. What does GLP-1 friendly even mean? Well, people taking medications like Ozempic and Wegovy are supposed to eat a certain kind of diet. Fruits and vegetables, lean proteins, whole grains. And a whole lot of Canadians are taking them for diabetes or weight management. And we're talking millions of people. And that number could rise now that the federal government has approved a generic version. So, will these drugs change what's on the menu? We look at how GLP-1s could impact the food industry. Then, low fat, low carb, protein maxing. We dig into why people have such a big appetite for food trends. Welcome to The Rundown. When you take medications like Ozempic, you eat less food and digest it differently. And it's important to eat the right kinds to avoid side effects and get enough nutrients, meaning there may be an opportunity here for the food industry. Sylvain Charlebois is a professor at Dalhousie University in Halifax and director of its Agri-Food Analytics Lab, and he joins us on The Rundown. How are you, Sylvain?
Good, how are you?
I am doing well, thank you. All right, help us understand, how big of an impact are GLPs having on the food industry?
It's pretty significant. Every time you visit a corporation or you actually talk to an executive in the food industry, they talk about two things, AI and GLP-1s. And absolutely, so it's impacting the snacking industry, the alcohol industry, both service, retail. It's been pretty impressive. The impact is actually quite measurable right now.
All right, well, speaking of measures, let's talk about some numbers here. I want to pull up some data from a poll done by Leger Healthcare earlier this year that looked at GLP-1 use in Canada. Approximately 3 million Canadians are taking a prescription GLP-1, which equals to about 8% of the population. Weight loss is the primary reason for interest in a GLP-1. Women are more likely than men to cite weight loss, while men are more likely than women to cite heart health or cardiovascular risk reduction. Now, cost is the #1 factor influencing potential use of a GLP-1. Amongst those with interest, over half say insurance coverage or a lower cost generic version would increase their likelihood of using a GLP-1. So Van, how consistent is this data with the conversations that you're having with users or with market specialists?
Yeah, results are very, very similar. So the 3 million number that you presented just there is consistent with what we found out. I mean, 3 million is basically half of Toronto. Mm-hmm. That's a lot of people. And it's a lot of people eating less, eating differently. The issue, of course, is impulse. The one thing that people may not know is that the food industry really relies on impulsive behaviors. We eat on impulse, we buy on impulse. Can you imagine a very rational consumer times 3 million? And that number is likely to go up. We have generics now that are available. 2 of them have been approved. Several others are pending, and that is likely to make the medication much more accessible. So we are expecting that 3 million to perhaps reach 5 million within the next 5 years. So that change is really significant.
You have kept your eyes on GLP-1 use here in Canada for a couple of years now. You reported in 2024, and I am curious, how has the research evolved since then?
It's been interesting because, of course, the public discourse around GLP-1s has always been around how it affects you, your body. So the medical field was very interested in knowing more about the GLP-1 phenomena. As food economists in the food sector, obviously, we were more focused on how that phenomenon is impacting our food economy. And back in 2024, 2 years ago already, we were hearing rumblings, and we actually had private meetings. We actually did publish our first report, and we did get phone calls from major companies, CPG companies that are in Canada wanting to know more about what is going on because they're probably seeing in their own numbers, top line and bottom line. I think they are seeing some changes there. We've seen companies like Nestle launching a GLP-1 friendly line of products, food products. We're seeing chains also adapting as well. Shake Shack is the most recent one with a GLP-1 menu, imagine. And so you can see that it is really profoundly changing how the food industry is designing their own R&D agenda, basically.
Well, so you mentioned, it's Shake Shack's what they call the Good Fit menu. This was launched back in December, specifically targeting GLP-1 users. Are we going to see more of this overt marketing in the coming months and years?
Oh, absolutely. And Anheuser-Busch actually just recently mentioned that they're looking into launching, get this, a protein fortified beer.
Okay.
That is no coincidence. And I'm sure you've been at the grocery store, even in restaurants, and they offer you protein fortified, well, anything really, coffees,
yeah.
Pop-Tarts. Pop-Tarts are protein fortified now. So you can see that. And the protein issue is, yes, there is a desire to eat more protein because the meat counter is extremely expensive. So people are looking for another protein fix, but also the GLP-1 phenomena is incredibly important here because people, when they take a GLP-1, apparently they seek more protein. And so that's why manufacturers are adding more protein to make themselves immune to what's happening with the GLP-1 phenomena.
I want to go back to your report where you estimated that, at the time in 2024, we're looking at 900,000 to 1.4 million Canadians were using GLP-1s at that time. Yep. I'm curious about the contributing factors here in terms of why those numbers have, if not doubled, if not tripled, in just a very short amount of time.
And by the way, the industry was downplaying our number 2 years ago. They felt, no, it's not that much, and it's not impacting. They were in denial for a while. But
Why?
now we have leisure. I think they just didn't know how to deal with it. I don't think they were expecting it. I actually had a chat with an executive from the pharmaceutical industry, and they're making obviously billions of dollars providing a GLP-1 to the marketplace. And he basically said the following statement: "We are trying to fix a problem the food industry created in the first place, making people unhealthy." That was telling. So this is not going to go away. The pharmaceutical industry is getting addicted, no pun, to the revenues generated by GLP-1s. And of course, on the one side, you have more money going to one industry trying to fix another problem seen as a problem created by the food industry. So the food industry, I don't think, was ready for this confrontation, this conflict, this tension between the two industries. And they're trying to figure out how to keep consumers engaged with their products.
Well, let's talk about, I guess, restaurants' bottom lines at the end of the day. As you mentioned, side effect of GLP-1s is a lower appetite. So we're seeing that shift in portion sizes and food industry a little bit. Is this the end of an era for, supersizing your fries or combos? What does that look like?
Well, I think we're past that already, not necessarily because of the GLP-1 drug, because I think the waste issue, like food waste, is a big issue. And I think companies are more careful when they're serving their patrons. But I mean, I've been out to restaurants with friends that are taking the medication, and you can see, I mean, they're not eating a full soup. They're not eating a full sandwich. And so I suspect that there'll be more right sizing going on when it comes to serving certain meals, just to make sure that they're not wasting anything. That's one thing. But I can tell that really the restaurant industry is going to struggle with this one for sure. I mean, how can you possibly sell to someone who's going to be eating less? He's not going to drink, or she's not going to drink. The entree is gone, dessert's gone. And those are money makers for the food service industry, which is why we've predicted this year that the net number of restaurants in Canada would go from 87,000 to about 83,000.
Wow.
So a minus 4,000. And so we are seeing more restaurant operators struggling in serving a marketplace with a growing number of people on the GLP-1 drug.
I have to imagine a lot of these restaurants and fast food chains also have to think of whether it's the family nucleus or, friends. As you mentioned, you're going out to places where someone is taking the medication, having to think of sort of the broader picture of who else is coming into the restaurant as well, I imagine.
It reminds me of the plant-based revolution. If you remember a few years ago, people were talking about plant-based vegetable protein. And again, restaurant operators democratized their menu. They didn't want to exclude the vegans, the vegetarians, because they often have friends. And if you actually don't have anything to offer to that one person, they're gone. They're not going to come to your restaurant. I think it's going to be the same thing for GLP-1s. Not everyone will be on a GLP-1, but that group of friends, family, will want to go to places where, well, the menu is absolutely democratized and flexible for everyone. And so I think that's probably what we're going to see more of, instead of just providing, or here you go, here's a menu for GLP-1 users. I mean, not everyone is going to openly say that they're on a GLP-1 drug, so it's not something you'll admit openly. When it comes to protein consumption, veganism, vegetarianism, people are more comfortable declaring that they have a certain dietary lifestyle, but the GLP-1 situation, I think, is much more sensitive.
I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about grocery stores. Are we seeing grocery stores changing their tactics and strategies here as well?
Not yet. I would say changes are more up the food chain. But here's the other thing happening at the same time as GLP-1, and both are somewhat intersecting. And those are and that's the new Health Canada logo. The fat, sodium, sugar logo that everyone is seeing at the grocery store. So what people don't see is that up the food chain, many companies are saying, okay, so we have these logos. We are not launching a new product if we have to put a logo on there. But the other motivation that they have is that if they actually have to put a logo on, it means that product may be less attractive for people on a GLP-1 drug as well. So there are two things happening at once right now in Canada, which is really interesting. And I would say it's probably going to make our grocery store healthier over time because of these two phenomena happening at once.
All right, I want to look into the future. As you mentioned earlier, a generic version of semaglutide has now been approved by Health Canada. Will we start to see the number of prescription users increase? As we should mention, a GLP-1 is a drug that you would have to take for the rest of your life. We have to note that there are some people who will go off of GLP-1s as well. There are some side effects that come with it, but will we see with these generics on the table now, will we see those numbers continue to grow?
Yeah, we are expecting that number to grow up to 5 million within the next 5 years as a result of generics being approved. I mean, we don't know exactly at what price these generics will be sold, but we do know that both Ozempic, that was approved in 2018, and Wegovy, that was approved in 2022 for weight loss specifically, is financially prohibitive. It's very expensive. And so we are expecting these generics to be more accessible financially, which is likely going to grow the market.
Sylvain, we are going to have to leave it there, but I really appreciate your insights. I'm sure we will continue and pick this conversation up in a couple of years and see where we land. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
I don't know about you, but it feels like every month there is a new food trend, new advice on what to eat, what to avoid, what's popular. So why are we always on the lookout for the next big thing? Samantha King is a professor and director of the School of Kinesiology and Health Studies at Queen's University, and she joins me. How are you doing, Samantha?
Pretty good. The sun's shining.
There we are. All right. Well, help me understand, how does social media affect our diet and food choices?
It's certainly an important factor in terms of reaching really broad and diverse demographics in a very constant way. But it's not the only factor. And, media has been monetizing and indeed playing on fears about our health and our strength and aging for decades before we had social media. So I try to emphasize that it's important, and it's especially important in moments of uncertainty and crisis. I don't think it's a coincidence that protein talk really intensified during the pandemic, for instance. We can't control global supply chains or, uh, the climate changes that might produce pandemics, but we can measure and fixate on the nutrients we're ingesting. And social media really helps with that.
When we talk about the ecosystem of social media, we have to talk about the role of influencers. Influencers arguably have a wider reach than health professionals, and some may even argue that they have the trust of many people online. What are your concerns with influencers offering health advice to people?
Yeah, well, one of the things I would say is that some influencers are, in fact, medical doctors and nutritionists, right? So there isn't really a clear dividing line. And I think that's one of the things that can produce confusion and information contradiction and overload. Uh, for me, the concern is less about the information. I mean, I think if one has a medical condition, one's doctor, if one is fortunate enough to have a doctor, is the person who's going to be able to help you manage your diet. Um, for me, it's more about the way that this constant encouragement and advice to focus on our diets in a way that treats our bodies as, machines to be tinkered with and fixed really diminishes our relationship to food as a source of pleasure and community. And that influence is really strong. I mean, there's a way in which we're all acting as if we're elite athletes, right? For whom finding the optimum diet combination is going to increase performance. But most of us are not in that category, right? We're just living our lives. And it's a really distorted our relationship to food.
Everywhere I go, whether it's a coffee shop, a restaurant, or even at my family dinner with my extended family, we are talking about protein. And I need to understand, why is everyone talking about protein?
That is a great question. There are a number of reasons. One thing to say is that our obsession with protein actually goes back to the 19th century when it was first identified as a category of nutrition. And the first protein booster, if not influencer, was a 19th century German scientist by the name of Baron von Liebig, who invented the first protein supplement. So there is a longer history, but there's also a shorter history because some of us, if we're old enough to remember, will remember that carbs were the charismatic nutrient of the 1970s. And then during the 80s and 90s, we slowly saw a shift towards protein as the fixation, and that's really intensified in the last 10 or so years. And it comes from a number of places. One is the industry. We tell the story in our book about the excess of whey that was created as a result of the industrialization of the dairy industry in the mid 20th century. And farmers needed something to do with all this toxic byproduct of cheese production, and were dumping it into rivers and streams, and it was killing the algae, and that was choking the fish. So it was presenting huge environmental problems. And they figured eventually, after many years of experimentation, to a way to dehydrate whey and create a palatable and digestible product. And that's the protein powder that is most popular today. If you see a protein fortified product on the shelves in the grocery store, that almost certainly has whey in it. And so they needed to create a market for that. And elite athletes and bodybuilders were certainly one such market. But that's not enough, right? You have to keep growing and building your market, and that's how we've now seen the protein fixation spread across demographic group. So I think that's one part of it. And then the other part of it is the association with protein, with strength, with muscle growth, but increasingly with, healthy skin and being full and brain power and menopause. There isn't a problem to which protein hasn't been offered as a solution. And it's very malleable in that way. It doesn't have the same negative connotation that, say, fats or carbs have. There's no such thing really as bad protein where there is, or too much protein, right? Where that isn't true of fats or carbs.
I want to move on to another trend that we're seeing, but very quickly, as a society, when it comes to protein, are we actually deficient in protein, or are we actually consuming a decent amount already?
Close to 100% of Canadians are eating enough protein, according to the official guidelines. So we're getting enough. Protein is in everything from lettuce to potatoes. And if you're getting enough nutrients overall, if you're getting enough calories, you're getting enough protein. The only exceptions to that are people who are seriously ill or frail, who may be required to take additional protein, but they are in the tiny minority of people in Canada. We don't need this protein, this extra protein that we're being encouraged to consume.
Okay, well, let's talk about another macronutrient that's getting its attention, fiber. I will admit, I myself might be looking at how I can possibly get more fiber in my diet. I might not be, quote unquote, fiber maxing, but help us understand, why do we become so obsessed with food trends?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, it predates the present moment. And I think it really has to do with the way we are encouraged and taught to think about our bodies, which is that we're responsible for them. No one else is gonna save you, right? I mean, we have a collapsing healthcare system. We have corporations who have a real interest in selling products that have a kind of automatic association with health, even if they're full of sugar and highly processed foods. There's a veneer of health that's attached to them. So there's a political motivation to ask people to look after themselves. There's a corporate motivation, and a good person in our society is a person who tries to optimize their health, right? Not just maintain it, but measure it and make it most efficient and productive, right? That's what we're supposed to be doing with our bodies. And these magic bullets that come along are extremely appealing, right? And I think the fiber one is really interesting. I'm being asked a lot about fiber in the last few weeks. I think it's a trend that began on TikTok. And my immediate response, because I too I'm subject to these trends. None of us can step outside of this ideology as much as we try to. I mean, I'm a professional diet skeptic, and I still can't look up my dinner without thinking about the nutrients in it. Uh, my kind of knee-jerk reaction is to say, okay, fiber is at we actually don't get enough fiber. The research suggests. There are health issues that we're facing as a society that are linked to not enough fiber in our diet. So maybe it's not as problematic as the protein obsession. On the other hand, my research ahead says, again, we're searching for this magic bullet. We're searching for this quick fix. We're lurching from one trend to another, and this is not going to save us. There is no single nutrient that is the solution to optimal health.
All right, I want to talk sort of demographics. Historically, diet culture has targeted women. Is that the case with these trends that we're seeing now?
I do think that's one of the really interesting shifts. I mean, certainly with looks maxing and just optimization trends in general, men are a huge part of that. And one of the things that I've written about is the muscular manosphere and the absolute centrality of protein and other supplement sales to the economy of the manosphere, to the way that influences male influences touting certain kinds of masculinity are able to do what they do, are able to make a living from that. So that's really shifted. And I think the kind of really critical relationship to the body that women have been taught to take up for decades and centuries is intensifying for men. And we can see this in the research. And we can see it probably in our everyday lives too. That now the focus, the particular goals of the diet might be different. The particular rationale for focusing on one particular way of eating versus another could be gendered. It's certainly, related to age and to some extent food cultures. But that's also one of the damaging things I think about these trends is that they're global, right? And they kind of override the the beautiful differences in diet that makes the world an interesting and pleasurable place to live in.
Well, you talk about that global reach and how effective and attractive it is to some people. If there is someone who has fallen for these diet trends, how do they cut through the noise? What advice do you have for people?
Yeah, so Michael Pollan, who's a famous writer and food critic, says has a nice saying, which is eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And I think that, as much as it's really hard as one individual person to resist these trends, I really like that mantra. We know that most of us are getting the food that we need. And at the same time that we see this absolute fixation on the components that make up our diet, this treating the body as a biochemical experiment or a motor car to be tinkered with. We also see a lot of pleasure in cooking and procuring food and eating and communicating about it and building relationships through it. And I think the more that we can focus on that and celebrate that approach, the easier it will be to move away from this really reductive and I think damaging approach.
Samantha, I really appreciate you taking the time chatting with us on the Rundown today. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking with you.
I'm Jan. Thanks for watching The Rundown. Have you ever changed your diet because of a food fad? I want to know. Send us an email at rundown@tvo.org, or as always, you can drop us a comment on our YouTube page. Until then, I will see you tomorrow. Coming up on The Rundown.
Conifers. We've been focused on conifers. Why? It's because when we started logging the old growth forests, it was the conifers that brought such great market value across the world. And so we thought, so the foresters thought, well, we'll just replace those conifers with more conifers, without the understanding or appreciation that a forest goes through a successional period where there's all kinds of species, right? There's deciduous trees, there's understory plants, and they grow together in a community. So they focus so much on these coniferous trees and then spraying herbicides and weeding out these other plants that really increase the flammability of the forest.
That's coming up on The Rundown.